Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2025, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and still I rise. And I rise today in the name of government of the people, by the people, for the people. Not government of the oligarchs, by the oligarchs, for the oligarchs, or for the plutocrats. And I surely do not rise in the name of government by the mob, for the mob. No, I rise in the name of government of the people, by the people, for the people. And today as I rise, I'm going to give two important reasons, why Vice President Harris presided over a Republican certification process earlier this week. Stated differently, I'm going to give two important reasons why Democrats did not get the most electoral votes. But first, allow me to commend Vice President Harris for leading the United States of America, our country, back to the moral high ground. I was proud to be here. In fact, I was seated on this very row at the very end. Proud to be here when the doors opened and the words were spoken, the Vice President of the United States and the Senate. And there she stood. She came forward. As she came forward, she was quite statuesque, comely, courtly. She looked almost majestic as she walked in. And as she moved down toward the front of the room, I, in my mind, recited a part of the 23rd Psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. I'm not saying that she was walking through the valley of the shadow of death. What I am saying is, I knew that if she could walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil, surely she could walk through the halls of Congress and fear no evil. And as she moved forward, I was taken to a point in my life when a song meant something to me. The song was, "You'll Never Walk Alone." She walked forward, never to walk alone. When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high. Don't be afraid of the dark. And then near the last stanza, the words are, walk on through the winds of life. I'm paraphrasing. Walk on through the storms of life, and you'll never walk alone. She proceeded up to the dais, and as she stood there, announcing the number of electoral votes from the various states, I could see her standing there alone. And I'm reminded as she did so of another song. This song has to do with standing alone. And the words are, just stand. After you've done all that you can, just stand. And I was reminded of all that she did. She worked hard. She worked long hours. She put everything into it. And after you've done all that you can, then just stand. Sometimes it's better to stand alone, which is what she did, than not stand at all. Better to stand alone than not stand at all. So I'm so proud of what she did, because in doing this, she helped us to reclaim the moral high ground that we lost 4 years ago on January 6th. To reclaim that moral high ground, because as she was presiding over this certification process, it was more than Vice President Harris presiding or Vice President Pence when he presided. It was the candidate who ran for president and did not win, certifying that the opposing candidate won. That was the moral high ground. That is something that the United States of America has had, and she was reclaiming it for the world, to let the world know that in the United States of America, we know how to win, but more importantly, we know how to lose. She claimed the moral high ground for this country. And in so doing, she was more than an example. She was an exemplar. She was a supreme, superb standard for the kind of behavior that ought to be exhibited on occasions such as the one she was presiding over. She made it clear to those who will look back in time upon this time that there are people among us who have dignity and respect for the process. She made it clear that while she did not win, she respected the process and announced the winner. I think that Vice President Harris can forever know that she has brought this country to another place. Other countries around the world, many of them envy what we were able to do this year, this week, juxtaposed to what did not occur 4 years ago, when a mob disrupted the process at the behest of the President of the United States of America. Who can deny that? Who can deny that they came here at the urging of the President of the United States of America, and that their behavior was nothing near exemplary? Their behavior was shameful. They marched with symbols of Nazism, with a gallows. They marched saying ugly things, vile comments. They stormed the capital of the United States of America. And in so doing, their behavior was disdainful and shameful as they marched through the halls. Some even went so far as to defecate in the Capitol in places where you would not expect such things to occur. Yes, there was a difference between this year and what happened 4 years ago. And that's because we had a vice president who was a candidate for president, who understood the necessity to have a peaceful transfer of power. So, Madam Vice President, though you stood alone at a time when it was appropriate and necessary. There are times when it is better, I've said it many times and I'll say it one more, it's better to stand alone than not stand at all. So you did. And you shall be remembered in history as bringing us back to the moral high ground. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to give the 2 reasons why she didn't preside over her own certification. Why Democrats didn't get the most electoral votes. 2 reasons. They have to do with legislation that was not passed. I'm going to walk through the legislation, and then I will give the reasons why the legislation didn't pass. The two reasons. The legislation. I've noted 6 pieces of legislation. The PRO Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, I've shortened the title, George Floyd Justice in Policing, Comprehensive Immigration Reform, and legislation to raise the minimum wage, as well as to pass the Equality Act. Those 6. Now let's take a look at these 6 with a bit more information. Legislation that would have made a difference for America and Americans, starting with the PRO Act. The PRO Act would have benefited all Americans. Labor unions were obviously desirous of having it passed, but it would have benefited all Americans. It would have benefited American laborers, the working class. It would have been the legislation that we need to help close the wage gap. This wage gap is something that has to be dealt with, because from 1967 to today's date, that wage gap has increased exponentially. Currently, the median income for a CEO is about $16 million, 16.3 to be a little bit more specific. The median income, and this is annually, income for a minimum wage worker at $7.25 an hour is a lot less than that CEO making $16 million. In fact, the CEO making $16 million would make 1,000 times more than the minimum wage worker at $7.25 an hour, which would be something more than about $15,000 annually. Who can survive on $7.25 an hour in the United States of America? You have to have at least 2 jobs and maybe 3. Family would have to have at least 2 persons working. The minimum wage has to be raised. If we pass the PRO Act, labor would be in a position to defend the desire, the need to raise the minimum wage, and could have pushed more for a higher wage. We have to raise it to a living wage. And if we should raise it to a living wage, then we can start to close this wealth gap. That won't do it in and of itself, raising it to a living wage. There is much more that has to be done, but that's a pretty good start. It would also help us to protect the right to organize. That right to organize is the means by which labor can move forward en masse to negotiate and to do that which is necessary to cause the industries in this country to raise the minimum wage. We have more states in this country with a minimum wage above $7.25 an hour than not. In fact, the states are ahead of the Congress. The Congress needs to catch up with the states and move on beyond that. $7.25 an hour is what is known as a slave wage in many quarters. So we need to pass the PRO Act. We did not. I'll explain why. 2 reasons in a moment. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, had we passed it, it would have enfranchised more voters, caused greater participation in the process. This act would have helped us by reinstating a version of the Voting Rights Act. In fact, it was in Shelby County versus Holder that the Voting Rights Act was weakened greatly when Section 4 of it was declared unconstitutional. And the preclearance portion of it in Section 5 could no longer be exercised. This Voting Rights Act would have helped to reinstate a version of the preclearance process. This Voting Rights Act would have helped to allow people to vote without fear of having the hours set such that it didn't help persons who might work late hours. There are some people who work late hours, they work into the morning hours. And in Houston at one point we had an opportunity to vote 24/7, 24 hours in a given day. I went out to see the people come in to vote. Well, we can no longer do that, but had this version of the Voting Rights Act passed, we would have made it easier for people to vote, harder for people to cheat, and brought more people into the process. Greater participation. Did not pass. George Floyd justice in policing. Did not pass. This would have assisted, wouldn't have cured, but would have assisted in arresting bad police behavior. You have seen the videos. I don't have to try to convince people anymore that there are bad police officers. Not all police officers are bad. Some are. This doesn't mean that you should paint all officers with the same brush. It simply means that the bad ones have to be weeded out. This piece of legislation, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, would have helped us to weed them out. Would have also dealt with these no-knock laws that have cost lives, dealt with chokeholds that have taken lives. George Floyd Justice in Policing would have made a difference. And I can tell you, there are many of my constituents who were eager to see George Floyd Justice in Policing pass and were very disappointed when it did not. Many of my constituents were disappointed when John Lewis Voting Rights Act didn't pass. American minorities, a good many, were disappointed. These pieces of legislation could have made a difference in voter participation. Let's move on to three more. Comprehensive immigration reform. This was a key piece of legislation that would have addressed the border issues, addressed labor issues, H-1B issues, all of these various means by which persons can come into the country for various purposes associated with work. Family reunification issues. This country has a history of keeping families together. We have strayed away from that history. This piece of legislation, comprehensive immigration reform, would have addressed that issue. And it would have addressed discontentment. What is discontentment? I hear it quite regularly when I'm out and about. I go into places where people are buying food. I hear people talking. Many of them are not talking to me. Many of them do talk to me and explain what I'm about to tell you. There are people in this country who just don't believe that it is fair, that it is right for persons who are coming into the country to receive what they perceive as benefits that they are not receiving. They talk about this discontentment. They're not pleased with the way the system is functioning. Comprehensive immigration reform could have given us the opportunity to address this issue. Did not pass. And of course, raising the minimum wage. I've spoken about this. Closing the wage gap. And when you raise the minimum wage, you do something that we talk about here quite often, and that is the rising tide theory. A rising tide will raise all boats, we say. Raising the minimum wage would create that rising tide that would raise the wages above the minimum wage. The minimum wage has an impact not only on those who are receiving it, but also others who are workers. It has an impact on the working class. Raising the minimum wage would have made a difference. I assure you there are people who would have been grateful that the minimum wage was raised, and it would have inspired them to come to the polls to vote. The Equality Act. This act would have protected the LGBTQ community. It would protect their civil rights and their human rights. Yes, the Supreme Court made a ruling about discriminating against persons because of their sexuality, but that's not enough. We have many more means by which they can be protected if we pass the Equality Act. So having gone through these pieces of legislation, these 6, now there are more. The Paycheck Fairness Act, that would help women to achieve equal pay for equal work. Women now make less than 90 cents for every dollar a man makes, generally speaking, in the country. All women, about 90% less. And over some number of years, I saw a figure of $1 trillion having been lost because women are making so much less. I believe that it was from the year 1967 to, I think it was last year. $1 trillion, assuming that my numbers are a little bit off. Maybe I didn't get the years exactly right. $1 trillion is still $1 trillion. Lost. That's money lost for health care, money lost for schools, children going to school, buying food, buying clothing, providing shelter, and also money lost for a pension, something to retire with. Lost because women are making less than men in the richest country in the world. Still do. Pennies on the dollar. That's what women are making compared to what men make. So the query is, why did we not pass all of these pieces of legislation? And the answer is because we had two senators, not the entire Democratic Party, not all of the Democratic leadership, 2 senators who would not do what Republicans did when they wanted to get a certain Supreme Court nominee confirmed. Republicans, when they wanted to confirm a certain Supreme Court nominee, challenged the process of coming to closure, and in so doing, moved to a point where you could appoint that nominee to the Supreme Court with 51 votes as opposed to 60. They did that. And it was along party lines. All of the Republicans voted to change the rules. Well, we had 2 senators when, to his credit, Senator Schumer brought the Voting Rights Act, John Lewis Voting Rights Act that I've called your attention, to the floor of the Senate. And to simplify it, made a request that it be passed with 51 votes as opposed to having to hit the 60-vote threshold and then come back and pass it with 51 votes. He made the request. It would have passed, but 2 senators, these are the 2 reasons, 2 senators, 2 Democratic senators. Now, why would you focus on Democratic senators when the Republicans voted against it? Because if you make your deposits in the Democratic Party, you expect your interest to come from the Democratic Party. You may get some from someplace else, but you expect the Democratic Party to perform. If you put your money into a Democratic corporation You expect Democratic dividends. So the Democrats, two of them, chose not to allow John Lewis Voting Rights Act to pass the Senate, which is an indication that none of the other legislation could have passed with 51 votes. And here's what would have happened had it passed. 50 Democrats would have voted to allow it to pass with 51 votes. That's not a majority. The vice president would be the tiebreaker. The vice president would have said to the world, we passed John Lewis Voting Rights Act and I was proud to break the tie. We passed George Floyd Justice and Policing. I was proud to break the tie. We passed the PRO Act. I was proud to break the tie. We passed the Equality Act. I was proud to break the tie. All of these various pieces of legislation could have been passed, but for two reasons, two senators did not do what more than 50 Republicans did to claim another seat on the Supreme Court. My friends, the prognostication from me, I'm speaking for myself and no one else, we would have seen Kamala Harris come through that door, still comely, still courtly, still stately, still statuesque. We would have seen her walk down. We would have seen her go up to the podium at the dais. And we would have seen her, if this legislation had passed, certify the election of Kamala Harris for president, as president to be more appropriate, if the legislation had passed. Two reasons. Two Democratic senators who refused to do what more than 50 Republicans did when they saw the opportunity. I'll close with this. Do not assume that those Republicans will now do what they have done in the past and oppose moving to 51 votes as they did when there was a Democratic issue on the table. I prognosticate here and now that they will move to use 51 votes if their agenda is stalled, and they will think nothing of it. They will do it with alacrity. They will pass their agenda. I guarantee you if they run into a roadblock, they will. If that becomes the issue, they are going to do it. And when they do it, I'm going to come back to this podium and I'm going to say, I told you so. Because we have suffered long enough from our history of using the filibuster to prevent progress, especially among the minorities in this country. And I'm not giving them a license to do anything. They're going to do what they would do. I'm just telling you the truth. They're going to do it. And they do it regardless of what anybody on this side of the aisle says. We have nothing to do with what they do. But I can tell you this, we have suffered because two senators would not pass legislation, vote to pass legislation that could have made a difference in the lives of the American people as well as in the lives of specific people who have suffered great injustices, grave injustices, lives lost. I believe that George Floyd Justice and Policing would save lives. Voters would receive a better path to getting their votes into the process. More of them would participate. I'm not saying the election was rigged, that's none of that. What I am saying is that we had legislation that people would have appreciated, and we could have marketed that legislation by simply saying, here's what we accomplished that benefits you at a different level. Yes, we passed the infrastructure bill, great bill. Yes, we passed the CHIPS Act, glad we did it. But friends, these are the kinds of kitchen table issues. This is the kitchen table legislation that people were talking about. And the lack of seeing this legislation passed dampened the enthusiasm of key aspects of the Democratic base. And I want you to know, there are some people who now want to back off of this legislation. They want to try to become Republican light. That's what I call it. We've got to be ourselves. This is what has been important to our base. We've got to stay with what was important to our base. There is nothing wrong with any one of these issues. Nothing has changed. We still need them. America needs them. America wants them. We just have to pass this legislation. I'm always grateful to have this opportunity to speak. It means something to me because I don't hate the country. I love the country. That's why I want to improve it with this legislation. It means something to me. I am proud to say that I stand here in this place to speak on behalf of people who cannot speak for themselves. And I pray that one day, we will be able to say that we were there to vote, take maybe hard votes, and pass legislation that makes a difference. I guarantee you, my colleagues on the other side, they run into a roadblock, they will. Our time will come again. We will have to take advantage of the time. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields his time.